Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the thick, sticky air of a medieval sick room. The candles flicker in a haze of smoke. The straw on the floor is damp with fluids you'd rather not identify, and the stench is so strong it could practically punch you in the face. The odor is a mixture of rotting flesh, spoiled herbs, and what we'd politely call human byproducts. You shuffle closer, nose wrinkling, and you realize this is the perfume of medicine in the Middle Ages. And before you get too cozy, I'll warn you, you probably won't survive this visit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling brave, drop a comment with your location and the time where you are right now. It's always fun to imagine this strange history drifting across the globe as we drift towards sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the straw, careful not to slip, and what strikes you first is not the sight of the patients, but the overwhelming assault on your nose. Medieval hospitals, or rather sick rooms, often just extensions of monasteries or makeshift huts, reeked of decay. There were no antiseptics, no sterile gloves, and certainly no lavender-scented hand sanitizer. Instead, everything from gangrenous limbs to festering boils oozed freely into the air. The smell was considered normal, part of life, and in a strange way even healthy. Because many people believed bad air miasma caused illness, if the air was already foul, well, maybe it meant the sickness was flowing out of you. One mainstream fact here: miasma theory, the belief that diseases spread through bad air, dominated European thought for centuries. Physicians argued that you got sick because the air round you carried corruption, often from swamps, refuse, or, yes, other people's bodies. So, ironically, the reek of this sick room was both the problem and, in their minds, a weird kind of cure. Now, as you hover by the bedside, you notice a bowl tucked beneath the straw mattress. It's filled with thick, yellowish fluid. Yes, that's pus, and it's being collected almost proudly. To a medieval healer, pus meant the body was purging corruption. Laudable pus, as it was called, was actually celebrated. If your wound oozed, congratulations, you were healing. Imagine congratulating someone today because their bandage is dripping. Not exactly Hallmark card material. And here's a quirky tidbit: some households actually hung dried toads above beds as a ward against illness, believing the toad's stench would draw sickness away. So, as if the natural aroma of medieval medicine wasn't pungent enough, you might add a shriveled amphibian dangling overhead. Smells like victory, right? You glance at the patients. Some are moaning with fevers, others coughing up phlegm, and one unfortunate soul is being treated for what looks like the plague. The air vibrates with misery, but there's also chanting. Priests often walked among the sick, sprinkling holy water and incense, hoping the sacred smoke might mask the overwhelming human odor. Spoiler, it didn't. Imagine trying to drown out the smell of a garbage dump with a single vanilla candle. It's not going to work. Historians still argue whether medieval hospitals truly treated the sick or mostly served as spiritual waiting rooms. In many cases, monasteries focused less on curing patients than on preparing their souls for death. The result: rows of beds crammed close together, little ventilation, and a communal bouquet of rot. But don't worry, you wouldn't have to smell it for long, because odds are you'd be one of those patients soon. Picture this: you try to breathe through your mouth, only to discover the taste of the air is somehow worse than the smell. It's metallic, sour, like licking a copper coin that's been soaked in vinegar. You lean back, gagging, while the healer dips a cloth into a concoction of garlic and vinegar, pressing it onto someone's wound. They genuinely believe the sting meant healing energy flowing in. To you, it's just more stink layered on top of stink. And of course, there's no concept of quarantine in these small rooms. One man's coughing fit is another man's death sentence. If you were lying 2 feet away from a plague victim, guess what? Sooner or later, you join the chorus of wheezes and rattles. That communal smell of suffering becomes, essentially, the smell of death marching closer. Let's pause for a modern aside. Think about walking into a hospital today. It smells like disinfectant, bleach, maybe a hint of overcooked cafeteria food. Clean, sterile, if not exactly pleasant. Now reverse that expectation instead of Lysol. Imagine every whiff is pus, feces, and sweat. Congratulations, you've just nose-travelled to the Middle Ages. And yet, the people inside these sick rooms didn't recoil the way you do. They lived with livestock indoors, handled chamber pots daily, and thought soap was suspiciously unnecessary. Their noses were battle-hardened, dulled by a lifetime of funk. For you, though, wandering through this world is like walking blindfolded into a sewage plant. But there's something oddly humanizing about this disgusting reality. Everyone peasant, priest, even noble was vulnerable to the same smells, the same sickness, the same humiliation of festering wounds. You could be a king and still stink like the common cold times 10. Smell, in a way, leveled the playing field. So, as you stand in that medieval ward, nose burning, stomach churning, remember, this was their version of healing for them. The gross stench was not just a byproduct, it was part of the cure, part of the proof that sickness was being driven out. And for you, drifting into the story tonight, it's the perfect reminder that history isn't just dates and kings. Sometimes it smells horrid, unforgettable, nose-wrinkling smells that tell the truest story of all. You shuffle out of that stinking ward and into the open air, hoping to escape the smell. But instead you hear a snip, snip, snip and a wet squelch. You turn your head and there, in a wooden stall under a striped canopy, a man in a stained apron is wielding a razor. At first you think he's just trimming a beard, but then you notice the red-soaked rags piled at his feet. This is no ordinary barber, this is a barber surgeon. The medieval multitasker who could shave your chin, lance, your boil, and amputate your toe, all before lunch. Barber surgeons weren't seen as prestigious. Physicians, cloaked in long robes and quoting Latin, looked down on these practical cutters. But guess what? If you actually needed something removed like an arrowhead from your thigh, you weren't calling the Latin-quoting guy with his astrological charts. You were calling the barber who had sharp blades, steady hands, and a certain indifference to screams. Mainstream fact. The red and white barber pole you still see today comes from this gruesome history. The red stripe symbolized blood, the white meant bandages, and sometimes a brass ball on top represented the basin used to catch drips. Next time you walk by one of those poles, imagine it spinning outside a tent full of shrieks. Comforting, right? You edge closer, and the barber surgeon flashes you a grin with too few teeth. On his table sits an array of tools, long knives, saws, pincers, even a cautery iron heating in the fire. They aren't sterilized. He might wipe a blade on his apron. If he's feeling generous, his patients aren't numbed either. Anesthetics? At best, you get a gulp of ale or a stick to bite down on. Sometimes both, which is probably why medieval people developed strong jaws. The man before you is unlucky enough to have a festering arm wound. With a quick slice, the barber opens it up and lets the blood and pus gush out. The crowd winces, but he's efficient, better than leaving it to rot. A boy runs over with a pot of cobwebs to stuff into the cut, hoping the threads will help it clot. Practical, disgusting, and somehow clever. You watch, half fascinated, half queasy. Quirky tidbit. Barber surgeons were sometimes hired to perform bloodletting not just for people, but for animals. Your horse too sluggish, let's bleed him. Your cow producing less milk, maybe she needs a trim and a vein opened. It was the same principle, bad blood out, balance restored. Historians still argue whether these animal treatments were based on any observable results, or pure superstition passed down through farming folklore. And speaking of superstition, you notice the barber muttering under his breath as he works. Some swore that certain prayers or charms could steady the hand, keep infection away, or even dull the patient's pain. But really, the only thing dull here is the blade after repeated cuts. The barber's tent is not just medical, it's entertainment. People gather to watch, partly because there's not much else to do on a Tuesday afternoon, and partly because pain was almost a performance. A successful amputation that didn't immediately kill the patient? That was worth a round of applause. Imagine your trip to the barbershop today ending with cheers and fainting spectators. And of course, the barber didn't only cut flesh. He still did haircuts, beard trims, and tooth extractions. You could walk out looking fresh or limping and missing a body part. He was a one-stop shop, and business boomed because, frankly, people were desperate. You glance at his hands scarred, nicked, permanently red-stained. He wipes the blade, tucks it into a leather pouch, and gestures to the next poor soul. A farmer with a swollen cheek sits down. With no hesitation, the barber grips a pair of iron pliers and yanks out a rotten tooth. The man howls, but everyone nods approvingly. Better to endure a minute of agony than weeks of jaw-throbbing infection. Here's a modern aside. Today you might complain about your barber using the wrong clippers, or your dentist forgetting the numbing gel. Back then, you prayed the barber surgeon's hand didn't slip while he was juggling your molar and the knife he just used on someone's infected leg. The fascinating thing is that while physicians often theorized endlessly about humors, those hot, cold, wet, and dry fluids they believed ruled the body, the barber surgeons simply acted. They cut, drained, stitched, and improvised in some ways. Their crude methods saved more lives than the lofty university doctors. A blunt saw might not be pretty, but it could stop gangrene from spreading. But make no mistake, watching a barber surgeon at work was not for the faint of heart. You step back, queasy again, listening to the patient's ragged cries. The barber rinses his hands in a bucket of murky water, which has been used by at least 5 people before. He dries them on his apron. Then he picks up the razor and, with the same tool he used for bloodletting, begins to shave the man's beard. Efficiency at its finest or nastiest, depending on your perspective. You leave the stall with a new understanding. In this medieval world, health and hygiene, beauty and brutality were tangled together. The barber surgeon was both healer and butcher, stylist and executioner of pain. His tent smelled of sweat, smoke, and iron, but for the desperate, it smelled like hope. You walk down the muddy street, still shaken from the barber's cheery butchery, when you notice a physician in a long robe, balancing a delicate glass flask in the crook of his hand. The sunlight catches the liquid inside, a pale yellow shimmer that swirls as he tilts it. He doesn't sip it. Thankfully, he just gazes at it like it's fine wine. Welcome to the glamorous world of uroscopy, the medieval art of diagnosing disease by staring deeply into someone's pee. Urine was considered the window into the body. Physicians believed it reflected the balance of your humor's blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. By examining its color, consistency, smell, even taste, yes, some actually claimed to taste it, though historians still argue whether this was more legend than common practice. Doctors could divine the secrets of your health. If your urine was pale, maybe your humors were cold, dark and thick, too much heat in the system. Red-tinged, oh, your blood was boiling, literally. Mainstream fact, there were actually urine charts, detailed manuscripts with illustrations of flasks showing different shades and textures of pee, each linked to specific illnesses. Physicians carried these charts like reference guides, pointing out to patients exactly what their golden liquid meant. You might think of it as the medieval version of Google, except instead of typing symptoms, you hand it over a chamber pot. You creep closer as the physician lifts the flask to his nose and sniffs. The crowd leans in, holding their breath. He frowns, nods solemnly, and declares the patient has an imbalance of excess heat. The recommended cure, a purge, maybe, some bloodletting, and, of course, a generous payment for his services. After all, interpreting urine wasn't free. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some doctors didn't even need the patient present. You could send a messenger carrying only the flask of urine. Like a medieval takeout order, physicians would read it and send back a diagnosis. There are even stories of tricksters swapping samples to test doctors or sneaking in animal urine. The results, usually still delivered with confident authority, proving the diagnosis often said more about the doctor's ego than your actual body. You imagine the embarrassment of carrying your pee in a glass bottle across town, hoping it wouldn't spill on your shoes. And remember, there's no privacy here. People would stop and ask, "Who's ill in your household?" or even hazard their own guesses based on the shade. In a way, it was public medicine at its most humiliating. Now, not everyone agreed on how accurate this method really was. Historians still argue whether physicians genuinely believed in the science of urine, or if it was partly theatre something that made patients feel reassured by a tangible ritual. What's certain is that people trusted it because they saw patterns. Pale urine often did mean dehydration. Dark urine could signal liver trouble. So, while wrapped in superstition, there was a sliver of observation hiding inside the spectacle. The scene grows funnier when you notice the doctor swishing the flask like a sommelier. He tilts, holds it against the light, mutters in Latin. Someone jokes that he's waiting for it to breathe. You can't help but smirk. Here's a man sniffing pee like it's a fine vintage from Bordeaux. If he starts talking about oaky undertones and a hint of asparagus, you're out. But the patient listens intently, nodding with gratitude. In a world with so little control over illness, even the illusion of knowledge brought comfort. The urine became a symbol, something visible and explainable. Unlike the invisible terror of disease, it gave patients a story about their suffering, even if the cure didn't always work. And of course, this ritual smelled bad, very bad. Imagine several flasks lined up in a warm, airless chamber, fermenting under the sun. The odor alone could knock you over, but the doctor carried on serenely, as though the stink itself was part of the wisdom. For a modern comparison, think about peeing in a cup for a routine test. Today, awkward, yes, but quick and private. In the Middle Ages, your urine was practically a public event. Everyone had an opinion, and the lab results came from a man squinting at bubbles. Not exactly high-tech as you move away. You realize this practice was oddly symbolic of medieval medicine, as a whole half science, half show, flavored with a generous dash of just trust me. Whether it helped or not, the ritual gave people hope, and sometimes hope was the strongest medicine they had. You follow the clink of buckets and the low murmur of a crowd until you stumble upon a bench where a man is lying very still. His head is tilted back, a cloth wrapped around his temples, and on his cheek wriggling and glistening in the afternoon light is a leech. Not just one, but several, suctioned onto his face like grotesque decorations. Welcome to the charming practice of leech therapy. Leeches weren't new in the Middle Ages, they'd been used since ancient times. But in medieval Europe, their popularity surged because they fit so neatly into the all-important theory of humors. If you had too much blood, too much heat or wet, the solution was obvious. Get rid of some. And why go through the trouble of cutting open a vein when you could just let a leech do the job while you sipped your ale? Mainstream fact, leeching was so widespread that entire leech books were written. Not just about the worms themselves, but about broader medical advice. The Old English word lice actually meant physician, so yes, in a sense, every doctor was a leech. Next time someone calls you a leech for mooching off their fries, just remember they're basically calling you a medieval doctor. You lean in closer, maybe too close and nearly gag. The leeches squirm as they feed, their bodies swelling with dark blood. The patient twitches, eyes squeezed shut, as though willing himself somewhere else. When the leeches drop off, fat and satisfied, the barber surgeon will collect them for reuse. Sterilization? Never heard of it. These bloodsuckers were passed from one patient to the next, as if they were friendly little pets. Imagine borrowing your neighbor's toothbrush, except it's alive and full of blood. Here's a quirky tidbit. People believed leeches had personalities. Some were thought to prefer noble blood over common, so physicians claimed their leeches refused to feed on peasants. Others were praised for their appetite, as though a particularly hungry leech was a sign of success. Entire jars of leeches were stored in apothecaries, wriggling around like little medical grenades, waiting to be deployed. You can almost hear the quiet slurp as the leeches feed, their tiny mouths pulling more than just blood. To medieval minds, they were balancing your body's energies. To you, it just looks like someone voluntarily wearing a living, squishy mustache. Historians still argue whether leeching was more placebo than practical, or whether it sometimes actually helped. For conditions like hypertension, Draining a bit of blood might have offered real relief, but for fevers, infections, or plague, it was as useful as putting a band-aid on a broken leg. The funniest part is the sheer variety of conditions leeches were prescribed for. Headaches? Slap a leech on your temple. Sore throat? Leech on the neck. Swollen joints? Leech buffet. Even hemorrhoids weren't safe, yes? Leeches were sometimes placed in areas you do not want wriggling things near. It's the kind of medical treatment you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Unless you were feeling particularly sadistic. You glance at the jar of unused leeches sitting nearby. They're writhing, eager, sensing warmth. The thought occurs. To you, at some point, someone had to discover this cure by trial and error. Picture the first medieval healer sticking one on a patient and thinking, well, either this works or we just invented the weirdest accessory. And yet, in their own bizarre way, leeches became a symbol of healing. They were prescribed across Europe, cherished by both peasants and nobles. Some monasteries even farmed them, tossing bloody scraps into ponds to keep the supply wriggling. If you lived back then, chances are your blood would have been tasted by one of these slimy creatures at least once in your life. For a modern aside, today, leeches are occasionally used in reconstructive surgery to encourage blood flow in reattached fingers or skin grafts. So, while the medievals didn't exactly understand why, their gross little therapy has outlived them in surprising ways. You might recoil now, but somewhere in a shiny hospital, a jar of leeches still lurks in a fridge. The man on the bench groans as the last bloated worm plops onto the cloth. The surgeon picks it up, drops it into a jar, and pats the patient on the shoulder. Balanced now, he declares with authority. Balanced, maybe. Traumatized, absolutely. You back away quickly, rubbing your own skin, half expecting to feel something slimy latch onto your cheek. In this world, medicine isn't about comfort or science as you know it, it's about rituals, beliefs, and the desperate hope that even the most revolting methods might keep you alive. And sometimes, that hope wriggled and sucked, leaving a trail of tiny bloody bites behind. You barely manage to shake off the phantom itch of leeches on your cheek. Before another scene unfolds, this time, the smell of smoke and iron mixes with the murmur of a crowd. A man sits in the middle of a wooden chair, his arm bound tightly with a strip of leather. He's pale, sweating, and staring at a bowl beneath him. You don't need a guide to know what's coming. Bloodletting. In the medieval imagination, blood wasn't just life, it was a fluid that could get out of balance. Too much blood made you feverish, restless, overheated. The cure? Open a vein and let some spill out, like draining a leaky barrel. And so the barber surgeon, steady as ever, ties a tourniquet, unsheathes his blade, and slices. Dark red streams into the bowl, and the crowd nods approvingly, as though this is the most normal Tuesday ritual. Mainstream fact: bloodletting was one of the most common medical treatments in Europe. For over 1,000 years, it was prescribed for almost everything: fever, headaches, indigestion, even melancholy. If you felt off, chances are someone would tell you to bleed a little. Kings, peasants, clergy, no one escaped the blade. It was the universal prescription. You watch the patient's eyes flutter as the bowl fills. There's no measurement here, no precision. Sometimes it's a few ounces, other times they keep draining until the patient faints. Passing out was seen as a good sign you'd been purged. Today we'd call it blood loss. Small detail, big difference. Here's a quirky tidbit. The timing of bloodletting was often guided by astrology. Doctors consulted charts to decide the perfect moment to slice, depending on the position of the moon and stars. Imagine calling your doctor today and hearing, "Sorry, we can't schedule your surgery until Mars is in Leo." That was very much the vibe. And it wasn't only arms. Veins in the neck, legs, even between the toes were fair game. Some manuals recommended specific veins for specific illnesses, like a bizarre road map of pain. For a migraine, open the vein near the temple. For stomach trouble, slice the ankle. You start to realize, if you had enough problems, you could walk away looking like a patchwork quilt of cuts. Historians still argue whether bloodletting actually helped anyone. For certain conditions like high blood pressure it might have provided temporary relief, but more often it weakened already frail patients, leaving them vulnerable to infection. And yet it persisted, partly because patients believed in it, and partly because doctors had little else to offer. Better to do something dramatic than nothing at all. The barber wipes his blade on his apron, and you notice his tools, a fleam, a sharp little knife designed for slicing veins, and sometimes even cups for cupping therapy, heated glass pressed against skin to draw blood to the surface, then cut open for easier draining. It's less like healing and more like livestock management. You hear a man joke in the crowd, "If bleeding doesn't cure you, at least you'll have fewer sins left in you." People really did believe draining blood could cleanse not just the body, but the soul. Illness was seen as corruption, something foul inside that had to be expelled. Bloodletting made that visibly, or sickness literally pouring out in a bowl. You lean a little too close and catch the metallic tang of iron, the smell of hot blood mixing with smoke from the brazier. It turns your stomach, but the patient slumps forward, looking oddly peaceful. Maybe he's lighter in more ways than one. For a modern aside, think about how we donate blood today. Sterile needles, careful measurements, a cookie afterward. Now, subtract every safety measure, add a sharp knife, a dirty rag, and an enthusiastic crowd. Congratulations, you've just booked your appointment with a medieval bloodletter. As the patient is carried away, weak but alive, the barber dumps the bowl into the street. The crimson liquid soaks into the mud, another casual addition to the stench of daily life. Children splash through it moments later, laughing, while chickens peck curiously at the puddle. No one flinches, it's just another day in the world. Where blood is both medicine and waste, you step back, dizzy from the spectacle, realizing that in this era, veins were faucets, life was a fluid to be drained, and the sight of your own blood leaving your body was not a nightmare but, bizarrely, a cure. You've barely left the mud-streaked street when you stumble into a small, smoky hut that smells faintly of damp earth and something unsettlingly amphibian. On the table sits a mortar and pestle, and beside it a pile of toads. Some are dried stiff, their legs curled like little claws. Others are ground into a pale, chalky powder. The apothecary at the bench hums softly while sprinkling this powder into a pot of steaming broth. You've just walked into the bazaar, world of toad-based medicine. Toads, frogs, and other small creatures were part of the medieval medical pantry. Physicians and folk healers believed animals absorbed the forces of nature, so their bodies carried healing properties. And if you're wondering who first thought, hey, let's grind up a toad and feed it to the sick, well, historians still argue whether it came from folk traditions, symbolic magic, or sheer desperation. What we do know is that amphibians were a staple of the stranger side of medicine. Mainstream fact in medieval pharmacology. Animal parts were as common as plants. Snake skins, lizard oil, and powdered antlers all made appearances in recipes. Toads, though, were especially popular for treating swelling, fevers, and even plague. Their bodies were thought to draw out poison. A dried toad strapped to your body supposedly sucked illness right through your skin. Sound gross? That was the point. You inch closer, watching the apothecary carefully scrape powder into a jar labeled with Latin script. Patients might swallow this powder in wine, sprinkle it on bread, or rub it directly onto a wound. Imagine seasoning your soup with ground-up frog. Bon appetit. Quirky tidbit, some healers believed the toad's stone a calcified lump supposedly found in its head could protect you from poison. These toadstones were set into rings and worn like magical medical jewelry. Were they real? Not exactly. Many toadstones sold in medieval markets were actually fossilized fish teeth, but people swore by them, convinced their gem-like charms would warm or change color when danger was near. Medieval Fitbit, except instead of counting steps, it told you when your dinner was toxic. You glance at the apothecary's shelf, rows of jars containing dried lizards, beetles, and snake skins. Each has its own use, but the toad dominates. The healer explains without being asked that if someone is bitten by a snake, pressing a dried toad against the wound draws out the venom. The smell is rancid, earthy and sour, but the confidence in his tone is rock solid. The patient sitting nearby is shivering, pale and coughing. The apothecary ladles out a small spoonful of toad broth and urges him to drink. The man grimaces, but obeys, gagging on the earthy sludge. Everyone in the room nods approvingly. If it tastes that bad, it must be working. Historians still argue whether these animal remedies were more ritual than medicine, but there's an odd logic to them. Amphibians live in both water and land, making them liminal creatures neither here nor there. In a world obsessed with balance, toads symbolized the ability to absorb and neutralize forces. Whether it worked or not, the symbolism gave hope, and hope, as always, was half the cure. For a modern aside, you've probably seen detox teas or trendy supplements that promise to purge toxins. Swap out kale powder for toad powder and you've got the medieval version. The marketing was the same, trust us. It pulls the bad stuff out, only with fewer Instagram influencers and more croaking. You gag a little as the apothecary proudly shows you a necklace made from dried toad legs worn as an amulet. People carried them to ward off fevers, curses, or bad luck in their eyes. This wasn't disgusting, it was protective. To them, you're the strange one for recoiling. The patient coughs again, but with a faint smile. Maybe it's the placebo effect. Maybe it's just the warmth of the broth. Either way, he believes he's better off, and sometimes belief was the only medicine that mattered. As you step back into the daylight, the image sticks with you, a world where illness was fought with ground toads dangling charms. And faith in nature's strangest creatures. You breathe deeply of the relatively fresher air outside and can't help but think, give it time, and they'll find even weirder cures. You walk further down the narrow lane, and the sounds of groaning men and clashing steel draw you toward an open field. The scene before you is chaos shields splintered, arrows jutting from the ground, and wounded soldiers sprawled on the grass. This is battlefield medicine in its rawest, nastiest form. No tents lined with sterile equipment. No clean bedsheets, just dirt, blood, and frantic improvisation. You kneel beside a soldier clutching his side. An arrow juts from his ribs, and his comrades are debating whether to pull it out or push it further in to snap the shaft. Neither option looks pleasant, and as they argue, a healer arrives, a grizzled man with a satchel full of strange supplies. Moss, cobwebs, vinegar, and maybe a rusty knife or two. This is the medieval version of a paramedic, except with fewer tools and much louder prayers. Mainstream fact: one of the most common battlefield treatments was to stuff wounds with moss or cobwebs. Sphagnum moss in particular was absorbent and even had mild antibacterial properties, though medieval healers didn't know that. They just knew it soaked up blood and seemed to help wounds scab over. Cobwebs were also popular, pressed into gashes as makeshift bandages. Soldiers carried them in pouches, ready to slap on a cut when swords started swinging. You watch as the healer rips a clump of moss from his bag and crams it directly into the soldier's wound. The man howls, but the bleeding slows. Then the healer pours vinegar over the area, and the stench of sour wine mingles with sweat and blood. It burns, but again, the logic is clear. If it stings, it must be driving out the poison. Quirky tidbit: some healers believed moss grew best where battles had been fought, nourished by spilled blood. They thought this gave it special powers, making battlefield moss especially effective at healing battlefield wounds. It's grim recycling at its finest. The soldier beside you, less lucky, has a gash across his thigh. The healer presses a handful of cobwebs into it, muttering a prayer to St. Luke, patron saint of physicians. The webs cling to the wound like gauze, and for a moment, you're almost impressed. Then you remember these webs came from some random corner of a barn, complete with dust, bugs, and who knows what? Sterile? Not even close. Historians still argue whether these battlefield practices saved more lives than they cost. On one hand, moss and webs sometimes helped clotting and may have slowed infection. On the other, shoving dirt and debris into wounds often made things worse. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to hold death at bay for another day. The healer now moves to a soldier with a severed finger. He pulls out a hot iron from the fire and presses it against the stump. The air fills with the sharp hiss of burning flesh, and the soldier's scream echoes across the field. Everyone else nods grimly. Pain was expected, silence would have been suspicious. At least with screams, you knew he was still alive. For a modern aside, think of battlefield medics today: tourniquets, clean bandages, morphine shots, helicopters whisking you away. Now strip all of that away. Replace it with moss, cobwebs, and a rusty blade. Congratulations! You're now patched up medieval style if you're lucky enough to survive the patching. You stand and look around. Men limp with makeshift bandages tied from torn tunics. A few lie still, covered with cloaks, already beyond help. In the distance, smoke rises from the field kitchen, where some unlucky soul may end up being treated with moldy bread poultices. This is medicine at its rawest, born not from theory, but from sheer necessity. And yet, there's a strange nobility here. These healers worked with nothing, risked infection themselves, and tried to keep men alive in the middle of chaos, crude. As their methods were, they were doing the best they could with moss, webs, and prayer. You take one last look at the bloodied field and realize survival wasn't just about strength. It was about who had the quickest hands and the strangest supplies. You leave the battlefield behind, ears still ringing from screams and wonder, into a small, cluttered apothecary shop. The air is thick with the smell of dried herbs, dust, and something faintly rotten. Rows of wooden shelves sag under jars filled with powders, roots, and chunks of unidentifiable matter. The apothecary, himself a weary man with ink-stained fingers, leans over a bubbling cauldron, muttering like a chef perfecting his soup. Only this isn't soup, it's medicine, though you're not entirely sure the difference matters in this century. Apothecaries were the medieval pharmacists, the ones who mixed remedies when physicians scribbled prescriptions on scraps of parchment, but with recipes blending holy water, moldy bread, and exotic spices. Their concoctions looked more like experimental cooking than science. They measured in pinches and handfuls, not grams or milliliters. If it smelled sharp, bitter, or downright revolting, that was a good sign. Healing had to hurt or at least taste awful. Mainstream fact: moldy bread was often applied to wounds as a poultice. Today we know mold can produce penicillin-like effects, but back then it was pure coincidence. Healers thought the green fuzz sucked out corruption, so the apothecary, before you mashes bread into a paste, stirs in garlic, onion, and a drizzle of vinegar and smears it on a bandage. To your modern eyes, it looks like rotten bruschetta. The apothecary grins proudly as he explains that garlic is hot and dry in humor theory, good for purging phlegm. He tosses in a pinch of pepper for balance. You start to wonder if he's treating illness or seasoning a roast chicken. Quirky tidbit: some recipes called for ingredients like crushed emeralds or ground-up mummy powder. Yes, actual mummy dust imported from Egypt was sold as medicine. People believed the ancient embalmed bodies carried mystical healing power. Imagine standing at the counter asking, "Do you have any ibuprofen?" and being handed powdered Pharaoh instead. You watch as a patient shuffles in, coughing violently. The apothecary listens briefly, then scoops a handful of herbs into a pouch. He hands over instructions: steep the herbs in boiling water, inhale the steam, and drink the bitter liquid. The patient pays in coins and a dozen eggs, because barter is as acceptable as silver. He thanks the apothecary as if he's just received a miracle. Historians still argue whether apothecaries were more practical healers or glorified snake oil salesmen. Some genuinely studied the properties of plants, recording recipes in thick leather-bound books. Others simply relied on tradition, passing down remedies without ever questioning why they worked or didn't. Yet their role was vital, bridging the gap between lofty physicians and hands-on barber surgeons. You lean closer to the cauldron and nearly gag. The bubbling brew smells like rancid cabbage mixed with wet dog. The apothecary stirs happily, explaining it's for balancing the liver humors. He lifts a ladle, offers you a sip. You shake your head furiously. He shrugs and downs it himself, to prove its safety, then promptly coughs until tears stream down his face. Everyone claps approvingly. For a modern aside, Think about going to a pharmacy today. Shelves labeled neatly with dosages, warnings, and tamper-proof seals. Now replace that with jars scrawled in Latin, stuffed with powders of unknown origin, and no standardization whatsoever. Every dose is a guess. Every cure is, essentially, a gamble with rotten soup. On a shelf nearby, you notice bundles of dried herbs, sage, rosemary, thyme. Some of these you recognize from your spice rack. Others are strange, like mandrake root, shaped vaguely like a human body and believed to scream when pulled from the earth. Apothecaries prized these for their supposed magical potency, even though handling one was said to drive people mad. Practical? Not really. Profitable? Absolutely. As you step back from the counter, your clothes smell faintly of smoke, vinegar, and mold. The apothecary waves, already turning back to his bubbling pot, tossing in a pinch of something unidentifiable. You realize you've just witnessed the medieval version of Medicine Meets Cooking show minus the Michelin stars, plus a lot of stomach-turning flavors. In this world, health didn't come from pills or vaccines. It came from whatever could be mashed, boiled, sprinkled, or smeared. Gross, smelly, and often surprisingly creative. And if it made you gag, well, that was probably proof it was working. You step back out of the smoky apothecary, but the acrid smell clings to your clothes, following you like an unwanted ghost. A few streets away, the atmosphere shifts again. There's a brazier blazing, its coals glowing white hot. A healer grips an iron rod in the fire until it shines orange, and beside him a man lies trembling on a bench. His leg wound, dark and festering, is about to meet its fiery match. You've just walked into the brutal world of cauterization. To medieval minds, fire was purifying. If a wound festered or bled uncontrollably, heat could seal it. In reality, that meant pressing a red-hot iron onto living flesh. The crackle, the hiss, the smell of burning meat, yes. Exactly like a steak on a grill signaled the supposed triumph of medicine over corruption. Everyone nearby flinches at the sound. But no one questions the practice. Mainstream fact. Cauterization was standard procedure in medieval surgery. It wasn't only used on battlefield wounds, it was also recommended for nosebleeds, ulcers, even tooth sockets. The theory was that burning stopped bleeding and expelled poisonous humors. And while it was agonizing, sometimes it did save lives by preventing deadly blood loss. The healer presses the glowing iron onto the man's thigh. A sharp sizzle fills the air, followed by a scream so right rattles your ribs. The smell is instant charred. Hair, scorched skin, smoke rising in a greasy curl. People turn away, gagging. But the healer stands firm, holding the iron steady until the bleeding stops. He lifts it away, leaving behind a blackened wound that looks more like a branding mark than healing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some manuals advised sprinkling wine or vinegar onto the wound immediately after cauterization, as though a splash of medieval salad dressing might soothe the agony. Others even suggested reciting psalms during the process, not just for comfort, but because words themselves were thought to carry healing force. Imagine your doctor today singing over you while wielding a blowtorch, comforting in the weirdest possible way. The patient's friends hold him down, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. His screams fade into groans, then into shuddering silence. He's alive, barely, his body shaking from pain and shock. The healer looks satisfied, nodding at the cauterized wound as though it's a job well done. You notice the iron goes straight back into the fire, reheated for the next poor soul. No cleaning, no rest, just heat, flesh, and the cycle repeating endlessly. Historians still argue whether cauterization was more about genuine healing or symbolic purification. To some, fire represented divine light, burning away sin as much as infection. To others, it was simply the only effective way to stop hemorrhaging when all else failed. The debate continues, but the reality is the same. Fire hurt like hell, and survival was never guaranteed. For a modern aside, think about how we use cautery today. In surgery's tiny electric probes, precise, sterile, applied in split seconds. Now replace that with a poker pulled from a campfire, wielded by a man in a blood-stained tunic, guided by equal parts experience and faith. That's medieval innovation in action. The healer now turns to another patient with a bleeding nose. Instead of gentle pinching or tissue paper, he shoves a heated wire up the nostril to sear the vessel shut. The man shrieks, thrashes, then collapses in tears. The crowd claps politely because in this world, screaming means healing. The smell clings to your throat as you back away. Burnt meat, sour wine, sweat, you can't escape it. For the medieval patient, pain was proof the treatment worked. For you, it's a nightmare come to life. And yet, beneath the horror, you glimpse something oddly admirable. These people fought death with the only weapons they had, even if those weapons left scars that lasted a lifetime. As the healer reheats the iron, sparks dancing in the brazier, you realize that in medieval medicine, the fire wasn't just in the coals. It lived in the courage of patients who endured it, screaming but surviving. Scorched yet stubbornly alive, you stagger away from the fire pit, ears still ringing with screams, nose stuffed with the greasy stench of charred flesh. Just when you think you've seen the worst, you hear a hollow tapping sound, followed by the unmistakable crunch of metal on bone. You peer inside a dim chamber lit only by candles, and what you see makes your stomach twist. A man seated, head strapped down, while a healer slowly drills into his skull. Welcome to trepanation, the medieval cure for headaches, seizures, or any illness believed to come from bad spirits trapped inside the brain. The logic? If something evil or dangerous was building pressure in your head, the solution was simple: let it out. And by let it out, they meant quite literally cutting a hole into your skull. Mainstream fact: trepanation is one of the oldest surgical practices in human history, dating back thousands of years before the Middle Ages. Archaeological skulls from Europe show neat circular holes with evidence of bone regrowth, meaning some patients survived the ordeal. In medieval times, the practice continued, blending crude surgery with spiritual ritual. The healer grips a hand-cranked trepanner kind of early drill with a serrated edge and twists slowly. The patient, held down by two assistants, moans as the tool grinds deeper. There's no anesthetic beyond a gulp of wine, no sterile cloths, no antiseptic wash, just raw endurance and the faint hope that once the pressure is relieved, the pain will ease. Here's a quirky tidbit: some trepanned skulls were later used as charms. People believed fragments of bone taken from these operations held protective power. Worn on a necklace or carried in a pouch, they were thought to ward off headaches, evil spirits, or even lightning strikes. Imagine walking around today with a friend's skull chip dangling from your cane, calling it good luck. You can almost feel the vibrations in your own skull as the trepan grinds. The assistants murmur prayers, sweat dripping down their faces as much as the patients. The candlelight flickers, and for a moment, you wonder if the shadows themselves are spirits waiting to be released. The healer finally stops, lifting away a small circular piece of bone. A hush falls. The man groans but does not die, not yet. At least, his head is swaddled in cloth, soaked quickly with blood. Historians still argue whether trepanation was performed more often for physical conditions, like severe head trauma, or as an exorcism to drive out demons. In many cases, the two were intertwined. Seizures weren't understood as neurological events, they were signs of possession. A hole in the skull wasn't just relief of pressure, it was a doorway for evil to escape. The healer now dabs wine-soaked rags against the wound, muttering blessings under his breath. His confidence is unshaken, even though infection is almost certain. The assistants release the straps, and the patient slumps sideways, breathing shallowly. Whether he'll wake tomorrow is anyone's guess, but tonight, everyone in the room praises the healer's skill. For a modern aside, think about brain surgery today: gleaming operating rooms, machines tracking every heartbeat, surgeons working with microscopes. Now contrast that with this candlelit chamber, a hand-cranked drill, and an audience whispering prayers. Yet somehow, against all odds, some patients survived, their skulls bearing scars of both trauma and resilience. You feel your own head throb in sympathy. The thought of someone grinding into your skull without anesthesia makes your knees weak, and yet you can't help but marvel at the audacity. These people faced the unknown with terrifying determination, using the only tools they had. The healer carefully places the discarded bone fragment into a small box. Perhaps it will be buried, perhaps sold as a charm, perhaps worn as proof of a miracle. The candlelight flickers again, and you step back, dizzy, your own head heavy with the weight of what you've just witnessed. In this world, healing wasn't gentle. It was brutal, direct, and often worse than the disease. But behind the gore and the groans was a desperate truth. People would do anything to silence pain, even if it meant opening their own skulls to the night air. You leave the candlelit chamber of bone and blood, stepping back into the cool night air. But your relief doesn't last long. Down the road, you hear a man calling out times and dates as if he's announcing a theater show. Only he's not a performer, he's a physician gazing at the stars, his parchment covered in strange circles and scribbled notes. Welcome to the star-crossed world of medieval medical astrology. In this era, medicine wasn't just about bodies, it was about the heavens. The belief was simple. The positions of planets and stars directly influenced your health. If Mars ruled blood and Saturn governed melancholy, then of course your treatment depended on their cosmic modes. Before cutting open a vein, physicians often checked the sky to see if the timing was right. Imagine scheduling your surgery today based not on hospital availability, but on whether Venus is in a good house. Mainstream fact: universities in medieval Europe actually taught astrology. As part of medical training, physicians learned to cast horoscopes not for predicting love lives but for prescribing treatment. Charts called asterisk zodiac man asterisk were drawn with constellations mapped onto body parts. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Cancer the chest, and so on. If the stars warned against it, a doctor might delay your procedure for weeks. You watch as the physician squints at his chart by candlelight. A patient begs to have a wound stitched, but the doctor shakes his head. The moon is waning. He mutters. To cut now would anger Saturn. The poor man clutches his bleeding arm, baffled but obedient. The heavens have spoken, and the doctor's word is final. Quirky tidbit: some medieval physicians believed you could tell not only when to operate, but also what foods to eat based on the stars. Feeling sluggish? Maybe Jupiter recommends beans. Got a fever? Avoid spinach while Mercury's in retrograde. Sounds absurd, but the logic tied into the humor system, blending diet, astronomy, and medicine into one cosmic smoothie. You tilt your head back and gaze at the night sky. The stars sparkle indifferently, while on Earth, lives hang in the balance of interpretations. To the medieval mind, the heavens were a giant medical chart. If Mars was too close to Saturn, it might explain why your nosebleed wouldn't stop. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors truly believed the stars dictated health, or if astrology was partly a marketing trick. After all, cloaking a diagnosis in cosmic authority made it harder for patients to question. It's not me, it's the stars was the ultimate medieval cop-out, but for many it offered comfort. If the heavens ruled your illness, at least it wasn't random chaos, it had order, meaning, and maybe hope. The physician now draws a crude zodiac man in the dirt, poking the constellation Aries above the patient's head. He nods solemnly, announcing that the best time to bleed him will be in 3 days. When the moon shifts into a more favorable sign, the patient groans but accepts it, resigned to waiting while the stars shuffle overhead. For a modern aside, think about horoscopes you see in newspapers or on apps today. You'll meet someone new this week or avoid big decisions on Friday. Now imagine those words deciding whether you'll get surgery or not. That's the level of trust medieval society placed in the night sky. The patient presses a cloth to his wound, dripping steadily, while the physician rolls up his chart with satisfaction. In this world, medicine wasn't just in the body, it was written in the heavens, glowing far beyond human reach. And though you might scoff, standing here in the flickering light, you realize how desperately they sought patterns in a chaotic world. To them, the stars weren't just distant lights, they were prescriptions etched across the sky. You turn away from the stargazer, but your steps soon lead you to a different kind of spectacle. In the corner of a marketplace, a man in a ragged cloak holds up a flask of yellow liquid to a crowd. People lean in eagerly, whispering. This isn't a physician, it's a self-proclaimed urine prophet, ready to read fortunes and health from what you'd rather not carry around in a bottle. If uroscopy was the physician's art, urine divination was the folk version, half diagnosis, half fortune-telling. These prophets claimed they could not only detect illness from the color and smell of pee, but also predict life events, marriages, prosperity, even death. The line between medicine and superstition blurred until the two were almost indistinguishable. Mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, urine analysis was genuinely considered respectable medical practice. Doctors used charts, yes, but so did charlatans who set up in taverns and fairs, diagnosing strangers on the spot. The difference: one charged you in Latin, the other in ale. Both relied on the same golden evidence. You watch as the prophet tilts the flask dramatically, letting sunlight catch the liquid. He nods gravely. This man will live another year, he declares, if he avoids fish and pays his debts. The crowd murmurs, impressed. The patient looks relieved, though his wife frowns, probably at the debt part. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some urine readers claimed they could tell a person's sins from their pee. To pale, you've been lazy. To cloudy, you're guilty of lust. To red, wrath burns in your veins. Imagine a world where your confession comes not to a priest, but to a man sniffing your chamber pot. You catch a whiff as the prophet swirls the flask again. It's foul, sour. And yet the people around you treat it with reverence. Children tug at their parents, begging for their turn, as though the chance to have their futures told in bodily fluids is an honor. Historians still argue whether people truly believed in these prophets, or simply enjoyed the theater. After all, markets were full of entertainers, jugglers, musicians, and quacks peddling miracle cures. A urine reader was part showman, part healer, part trickster. And in a time when death hovered constantly, any scrap of reassurance, even from pee, was worth a coin. The prophet now holds up another flask, squinting. He predicts the woman's husband will fall ill in the winter unless she burns rosemary in their home. The crowd gasps, nods. He pockets the coin and moves on to the next. You notice his cloak is patched with dozens of stains, perhaps from spills of his prophetic samples. You're not sure what's worse, the fraud or the smell that clings to him. For a modern aside, think of those palm readers or horoscope apps that promise insight into your life. Now imagine the same service, but instead of your birth chart, you hand over a warm flask of urine. That's the medieval upgrade, slightly less mystical, significantly more gross. The prophet finishes his round, pocketing coins, eggs, and bread from grateful clients. His crowd disperses, some comforted, others worried, all convinced they've glimpsed the future. You remain, wrinkling your nose, realizing that in this world, health, fate, and faith were poured into the same glass flask and swirled until someone declared meaning. From the stench, the prophet's crowd drifts away, but you catch another smell on the breeze, this one heavier, more oppressive, like sweat mixed with sour milk and old wounds. You follow it until the buildings open into a courtyard lined with stone arches. This is no bustling market, it's a medieval hospital. And if you expected the clean sterility of a modern ward, prepare yourself, because here, medicine and misery sleep side by side. Medieval hospitals weren't built for curing in the way you imagine today. Many were run by monasteries, focused less on treatment and more on spiritual care. The sick, the poor, and the dying were laid out in long rows of beds, often crammed shoulder to shoulder. The logic was that proximity to holy relics, prayers, and charity would ease suffering, or at least prepare souls for the afterlife. Physical healing was secondary, if it happened at all. Mainstream fact: one of the most famous medieval hospitals, Hôtel in Paris, was so overcrowded that sometimes 4 or more patients shared a single bed. With little ventilation and constant, close contact, infections spread like wildfire. Yet people still flocked there, believing it was better to die near the church's blessing than alone in a hut. You step inside and the stench hits like a wall. Straw mats soaked with urine, bandages caked in pus. and the unwashed bodies of dozens of patients all pressed together in suffocating air. A monk pauses, swinging incense in a brass censer, the sweet smoke of frankincense battling valiantly against the sour smell of sickness. Spoiler, the incense loses. Quirky tidbit, some hospitals kept animals inside, like cats and even pigs, to eat scraps and keep vermin down. Of course, the animals often brought their own fleas and filth, adding to the mix. Imagine lying feverish in bed while a pig snuffles at your toes. It wasn't unusual here. You walk past a row of patients. One coughs violently, flecks of blood on his lips. Another moans in delirium, clutching a rosary. A third, barely breathing, is attended by a nun who gently wipes his forehead with a cloth dipped in wine. It's tender, almost beautiful, but the hopelessness is clear. Few expect to leave this place cured. Survival is a matter of luck and divine will. Historians still argue whether medieval hospitals should be seen as centers of healing or more, like spiritual hospices. Some evidence suggests certain orders did practice treatments with herbs and basic surgery, but the sheer overcrowding and lack of sanitation often made these hospitals more dangerous than staying at home. Still, for the poor and abandoned, they offered food, shelter, and dignity in their last days. You notice a crucifix hanging at the far end of the ward, candles flickering beneath it. Patients strain to face it, whispering prayers. In this world, salvation mattered more than survival. Medicine wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul's readiness. For a modern aside, think of walking into a sleek, white hospital ward today. Machines beeping softly, nurses bustling with gloves and masks. Now swap that image for rows of wooden cots crammed in a smoky hall, no soap, no privacy, and the air so foul you can taste it. That was the medieval version of healthcare. You step back toward the door, but the smell clings to your clothes and hair. Outside, the fresh air feels almost holy. Behind you, chants rise as monks sing prayers over the sick. In this place, healing wasn't measured in recovery rates, it was measured in the comfort of a prayer, the touch of a nun's hand, and the faint hope that death might be just a little less frightening in the company of faith. You barely escape the suffocating stink of the hospital when a strange figure catches your eye. Tall, cloaked in black, with a long-beaked mask jutting from his face, he looks like a cross between a bird and a nightmare. Children shriek and hide, while adults cross themselves nervously. This is the infamous plague doctor striding through the streets like death's personal messenger. The mask, with its curved beak, wasn't just for show. It was stuffed with herbs, lavender, rosemary, cloves. Sometimes even vinegar-soaked sponges meant to filter the foul air. Remember miasma, that bad air theory? The beak was a portable defense system, turning the doctor into a walking incense burner. To the sick, he looked terrifying. To himself, he looked protected. Whether it worked or not, well, historians still argue whether it provided any real benefit or was more psychological armor. Mainstream fact: the plague doctor's outfit, mask, wax cloak, gloves, and stuff was one of the first attempts at protective medical clothing. The waxed fabric was supposed to repel disease-laden vapors. The stuff let doctors prod patients from a distance, sparing them direct contact. It wasn't foolproof, but compared to barehanded barbers, it was at least an attempt at PPE. You edge closer as the doctor pauses at a house marked with a red cross. Inside, a family lies feverish, buboes swelling on their necks. The doctor waves a perfumed handkerchief, mutters about corrupt air, and begins his examination. He doesn't touch the patients directly. He pokes with his cane, lifts blankets with the hooked end, and scribbles notes no one else can read. His presence is both terrifying and strangely reassuring. At least someone is doing something, even if that something is poking you like livestock. Quirky tidbit: some plague doctors believed their beaks worked best if stuffed with exotic substances like crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn spoiler, usually narwhal ivory. These luxury fillers were marketed to the wealthy as superior protection. Imagine upgrading your PPE mask today by jamming it full of glittery crystals and bragging about it on medieval TikTok. You can hear muffled cries from the sick room as the doctor recommends treatments. Bloodletting, of course, and a poultice of onions and butter. He also advises burning juniper in the room to cleanse the air. The family nods weakly, clinging to his words. In a world collapsing from plague, even superstition felt like hope. But the doctor himself is feared. Neighbors whisper that he's not a healer, but an omen that if the beaked figure visits your house, it's already too late. Children hide behind doors, terrified of the birdman whose shadow means death. Yet patients, desperate, submit to his cane and his strange mutterings, because any chance is better than none. Historians still argue whether plague doctors actually helped, or whether their main function was bureaucratic recording deaths, keeping tally of the sick, managing quarantines. Many were hired by towns on official contracts, more administrators than saviors, and yet their image has become iconic, the very face of medieval pestilence. For a modern aside, think of doctors in hazmat suits today, sealed masks, plastic visors, layers of protection. Now imagine the medieval version, a bird mask stuffed with herbs and a stick to poke you from 6 feet away. It's social distancing, 14th century style. The doctor finally leaves the house, scribbling on his parchment before moving on. Behind him, the family coughs weakly, the smell of herbs mingling with the stench of sickness. The crowd parts as he walks, fear and respect in equal measure. You catch one last glimpse of the curved beak silhouetted against the setting sun, and you realize this birdman isn't just a doctor. He's the embodiment of a world terrified, clinging to ritual and cloth against an enemy no one could see. The image of the bird-masked doctor fades as you wander toward a chapel where candles flicker, and the air hums with whispered prayers. Pilgrims kneel before a gleaming reliquary, its crystal window revealing a bone wrapped in faded silk. Some kiss the glass, others press handkerchiefs against it, hoping to carry home a trace of its power. You've stepped into the strange and crowded world of holy relic healing in medieval medicine. Saints' bones, hair, or even scraps of clothing were thought to radiate divine healing. A pilgrimage to touch or even glimpse a relic could be prescribed as seriously as a course of herbs. After all, if sickness was seen as punishment or imbalance, then what better cure than a fragment of holiness itself? Mainstream fact. Relics weren't rare curiosities, they were everywhere. The skull of St. Catherine here, a vial of Christ's blood there. Whole churches built around fragments of saints. Hospitals were often located near relic shrines, so the sick could combine prayer with treatment. Healing was less about medicine than proximity to the sacred. You watch as a mother lifts her feverish child toward the reliquary, tears streaking her face. She believes the saint's virtue can seep into the child through touch. Others pin strips of cloth to the shrine, later carrying them home as talismans. The crowd murmurs with hope, the atmosphere thick with incense and desperation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Not all relics were legitimate. Merchants sometimes sold dubious, saintly remains like chicken bones or random teeth, swearing they came from holy martyrs. Entire markets thrived on relic trade, and gullible buyers treasured their fragments of divine thema. Historians still argue whether authorities genuinely believed in all relics, or simply tolerated the trade because it kept faith. And coin flowing, the priest beside the shrine chants softly, sprinkling holy water over the gathered pilgrims. A man with a festering leg wound unwraps his bandage and presses it against the reliquary. Grimacing, he believes the saint's intercession will cleanse the rot, whether it helps or not. The act brings him comfort, and in this world, that comfort might be the most powerful medicine of all. For a modern aside, think about visiting a famous hospital today with the best specialists and high-tech machines. Now imagine instead traveling days to kneel before a glass case holding a saint's finger bone, convinced it's your best shot at survival. To the medieval mind, the relic wasn't superstition, it was frontline healthcare. The chapel smells of wax, incense, and human sweat, yet the people here breathe deeply, as though inhaling holiness itself. Some leave walking sticks behind, claiming miraculous recovery. Others leave still limping, but at least reassured that their suffering has meaning. In an age where medicine often hurt more than it healed, faith was the gentlest cure available. Daughters, you step back, the bells toll, and pilgrims press closer to the reliquary. Their hope lingers in the air, mingling with candle smoke. You realize that in this era, healing wasn't just herbs or knives, it was bones wrapped in silk, prayers whispered in the dark, and the fragile belief that the divine might touch human flesh. The chapel's candlelight fades behind you, replaced by the grim sound of wood being sawed and muffled cries that rise into piercing screams. You follow the noise to a courtyard where a man sits strapped to a bench, his leg extended across a rough wooden plank. Beside him, a surgeon sharpens a saw on a wet stone, sparks flickering in the dusk. This is no repair job on furniture, it's an amputation, and it's happening right before your eyes. In the Middle Ages, amputation was the last resort for infected limbs, crushed bones, or battlefield injuries. With no antibiotics, gangrene spread fast. The only hope was to cut away the diseased part before it killed the whole body. Brutal? Absolutely. Necessary? Sometimes the only chance. Mainstream fact. Amputations were done without anesthesia. The patient was restrained by assistants, given maybe a swig of strong wine, a stick to bite, and the promise of prayer. The surgeon's job was speed. A good amputation meant a clean cut in under a minute before the patient passed out or worse, died mid-procedure. You watch as the surgeon grips the saw, his eyes locked on the man's thigh. Assistants hold the writhing patient down, one pinning his shoulders, another gripping his foot. The first stroke is quick, decisive, the sound of metal teeth grinding through flesh and bone. The scream that erupts is raw, animal, echoing across the square. Quirky tidbit: some surgeons carried small brass bells and rang them during amputations, not to distract the patient, but to drown out their screams from unnerving others waiting their turn. Imagine sitting in line, hearing the cheerful chime of bells masking agony, and knowing exactly what was happening behind the curtain. The saw screeches again, the smell of blood and sweat mingling with the iron tang in the air. The surgeon's forehead drips with sweat as he works quickly, the assistants straining to keep the patient still. Then, suddenly, silence. The leg falls away. The stump is immediately cauterized with a glowing iron. The hiss of burning flesh fills the air. The patient's scream cuts off into unconsciousness, and a crowd breathes out as if they've been holding their lungs hostage. Historians still argue whether medieval amputations saved more lives than they ended. Some patients survived, their stumps wrapped in moss or cloth, scars marking their entrance. Others succumbed to infection, shock, or blood loss. Records show both miracles and tragedies, with outcomes depending more on luck than skill. The surgeon now lifts the severed leg, showing it briefly before tossing it aside like waste. An assistant presses a poultice of wine-soaked cloth onto the cauterized stump, whispering a prayer. The patient lies pale and limp, chest rising faintly. Whether he lives to see morning is uncertain, yet the onlookers nod. This was considered success, the only way to stop death from creeping further. For a modern aside, today, amputations are sterile, controlled with anesthesia, clean saws, and careful aftercare. Prosthetics restore mobility. Antibiotics fight infection. In the Middle Ages, you lost a limb and prayed your healer's speed matched your body's will to live. The difference is the gap between horror and hope. The surgeon wipes his sore on a rag, ready for the next case. No sterilization, no rest. Another patient steps forward, limping, terrified but resigned. You back away, shaken, realizing that in this world, survival wasn't gentle. It was loud, messy, and carved with steel. As the screams fade into night, you feel the weight of what you've witnessed. In medieval medicine, hope came at a terrible cost, measured in missing limbs and the courage of those who endured the saw. The echoes of the saw fade as you wander deeper into the town, but now the air rings with a different kind of cry, higher pitched. Short bursts of agony followed by the sound of metal clinking. You round a corner and there it is, a wooden chair with straps, a man slumped back, his mouth forced open with a crude iron gag. In front of him stands a barber surgeon gripping a pair of terrifying pliers. You've stepped into the world of medieval dentistry. and it's every bit as nightmarish as you'd imagine. Teeth rotted easily in this age of coarse bread. Honeyed ale and no toothbrushes, cavities, abscesses, and gum disease were common. And when the pain grew unbearable, there was only one solution: extraction. Forget fillings. Forget root canals, just yank it out. And so the tools of dental torture emerged: iron pliers, pelicans, a hooked lever tool, and tongs that looked better suited for a blacksmith than a mouth. Mainstream fact: dental extractions were often performed by barber surgeons at fairs and markets. Turning medicine into spectacle, the tooth puller set up a stall, complete with banners and music to advertise his services. Crowds gathered to watch, partly for entertainment and partly because misery loves company. Patients screamed, fainted, or flailed while their rotten molars were wrenched out, and the crowd applauded. You wince as the barber plants his knee on the patient's chest for leverage, twisting the pliers inside the man's mouth. There's a sickening crack, followed by a howl that rattles your bones. The tooth finally comes free, root dangling, streaked with blood. The barber holds it aloft like a trophy, the crowd cheering. The patient slumps, half-conscious, but oddly relieved the agony that haunted his jaw is gone, even if he may not feel his face again for days. Here's a quirky tidbit: some tooth pullers wore brightly colored costumes and added comedy routines to their practice, cracking jokes as they cracked teeth. They display strings of pulled teeth as proof of their skill, sometimes hanging them like garlands. Imagine your dentist today decorating the waiting room with the molars of past. Patience. Not exactly reassuring. The smell here is different from the battlefield or hospital. It's a sharp, sour odor of bad breath, blood, and infection. You glance at the instruments on the table: pliers, files, and a hammer. Some were used to smash teeth into pieces if they resisted, leaving jagged stumps behind. Infections from these brutal extractions often spread, but in the moment, patients felt desperate enough to risk anything for relief. Historians still argue whether medieval dental practices were entirely destructive or if some practitioners experimented with early fillings. Records mention resin, beeswax, and even gold leaf being used to pack cavities. But the dominant cure remained removal: quick, messy, final. The barber wipes his bloody pliers on his apron, grinning. He gestures to the next patient in line, a nervous boy clutching his swollen cheek. The boy's mother shoves him forward, whispering prayers. There is no escape better a few minutes of horror than weeks of festering pain. For a modern aside, think about reclining in a dentist's chair today: numbing injection, sterile tools, maybe even soothing music in the background. Now strip all of that away. No anesthetic, no sanitation, just iron pliers and an audience cheering your misery. Congratulations, you've just booked a medieval dental appointment. The boy climbs onto the chair, trembling as the barber pries open his mouth. The pliers clamp down, the crowd leans in, and you step back, shuddering. In this world, the line between healer and torturer blurred, and the price of relief was paid in blood, screams, and shattered enamel. The echoes of tooth-pulling fade behind you. But soon you hear another sound: low chanting, broken by screams that aren't caused by saws or pliers. You edge closer and find yourself in a dim chapel, the air heavy with incense. A young man thrashes on the floor, his wrists bound with rope. A priest stands over him, sprinkling holy water and shouting Latin verses. This isn't a medical procedure, at all, at least not in your sense of the word. It's an exorcism, performed because the patient's mind has betrayed him. In the Middle Ages, mental illness was often seen not as a medical condition but as a spiritual invasion. Depression could be mistaken for sloth or sin, anxiety for cowardice, epilepsy for demonic possession. If someone shouted nonsense in the streets or shook uncontrollably, neighbors whispered of devils. The treatment, not rest or therapy but prayer, relics, or outright exorcism. Mainstream fact: monasteries sometimes took in the mentally ill, but rather than medical treatment, patients received confinement, prayer, and penance. Some were chained in cells, fed sparingly, and left to fast out their demons. Others were paraded through churches for public prayers. The logic was that healing came from God, Not from the body's chemistry. You watch the priest press a crucifix against the man's forehead. The patient screams, whether from fear, pain, or sheer exhaustion, you can't tell. Onlookers cross themselves, some crying, some whispering. They believe this is holy warfare, a battle for the man's soul. In reality, it might be epilepsy or schizophrenia, conditions the era had no words for. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed music could drive out madness. Fiddlers were hired to play lively tunes in asylums or at bedsides, hoping rhythm might unsettle the demon and lure it out. Imagine replacing modern therapy sessions with a medieval jam session. Doctor, I'm feeling anxious. No problem. Let's try 3 hours of bagpipes. The priest continues his ritual, sprinkling salt into the man's mouth, chanting louder. The patient writhes, eyes rolling back. The crowd gasps when he finally collapses, limp, silent. To them, this is proof the demon has fled. To you, it looks like exhaustion has won. Still, the onlookers cheer quietly, their faith in divine healing reaffirmed. Historians still argue whether exorcisms sometimes provided a form of placebo therapy. Did the intense ritual, the attention, and the belief in healing occasionally soothe sufferers, or did it worsen their conditions by layering fear and stigma on top of illness? The line between help and harm is blurry, written in whispers and screams. The chapel smells of incense, sweat, and candle smoke. It's oppressive, but strangely mesmerizing, as though belief itself hangs in the air. You glance at a young woman kneeling nearby, her wrists scarred. She clutches a rosary, whispering that she too feels haunted. The priest nods, promising to schedule another ritual. You realize this isn't isolated, it's systemic. Mental illness wasn't hidden in silence, it was put on display as evidence of spiritual struggle. For a modern aside, today, mental health treatment might involve therapy, medication, and support groups. In the medieval world, it was chains, prayers, and exorcisms, sometimes gentle, often brutal. All was framed as a fight between heaven and hell. As you slip out of the chapel, the chanting fades. But the image lingers, a man trembling on the stone floor, his suffering misread as demonic fury. In this world, the mind was a battlefield, and medicine didn't speak its language. Only the priests did, and their cures were drenched in incense and fear. The echoes of the saw fade as you wander deeper into the town, but now the air rings with a different kind of cry, higher pitched. Short bursts of agony followed by the sound of metal clinking. You round a corner and there it is, a wooden chair, with straps, a man slumped back, his mouth forced open with a crude iron gag. In front of him stands a barber surgeon gripping a pair of terrifying pliers. You've stepped into the world of medieval dentistry, and it's every bit as nightmarish as you'd imagine. Teeth rotted easily in this age of coarse bread. Honeydale and no toothbrushes, cavities, abscesses, and gum disease were common. And when the pain grew unbearable, there was only one solution: extraction. Forget fillings, forget root canals, just yank it out. And so the tools of dental torture emerged: iron pliers, pelicans, a hooked lever tool, and tongs that looked better suited for a blacksmith than a mouth. Mainstream fact: dental extractions were often performed by barber surgeons at fairs and markets. Turning medicine into spectacle, the tooth puller set up a stall, complete with banners and music to advertise his services. Crowds gathered to watch, partly for entertainment and partly because misery loves company. Patients screamed, fainted, or flailed while their rotten molars were wrenched out, and the crowd applauded. You wince as the barber plants his knee on the patient's chest for leverage, twisting the pliers inside the man's mouth. There's a sickening crack, followed by a howl that rattles your bones. The tooth finally comes free, root dangling, streaked with blood. The barber holds it aloft like a trophy, the crowd cheering. The patient slumps, half conscious, but oddly relieved. The agony that haunted his jaw is gone, even if he may not feel his face again for days. Here's a quirky tidbit: some tooth pullers wore brightly colored costumes and added comedy routines to their practice, cracking jokes as they cracked teeth. They display strings of pulled teeth as proof of their skill, sometimes hanging them like garlands. Imagine your dentist today decorating the waiting room with the molars of past patients. Not exactly reassuring. The smell here is different from the battlefield or hospital. It's a sharp, sour odor of bad breath, blood, and infection. You glance at the instruments on the table: pliers, files, and a hammer. Some were used to smash teeth into pieces if they resisted, leaving jagged stumps behind. Infections from these brutal extractions often spread, but in the moment, patients felt desperate enough to risk anything for relief. Historians still argue whether medieval dental practices were entirely destructive or if some practitioners experimented with early fillings. Records mention resin, beeswax, and even gold leaf being used to pack cavities. But the dominant cure remained removal: quick, messy, final. The barber wipes his bloody pliers on his apron, grinning. He gestures to the next patient in line, a nervous boy clutching his swollen cheek. The boy's mother shoves him forward, whispering prayers. There is no escape better a few minutes of horror than weeks of festering pain. For a modern aside, think about reclining in a dentist's chair today. Numbing injection, sterile tools, maybe even soothing music in the background. Now strip all of that away. No anesthetic, no sanitation. Just iron pliers and an audience cheering your misery. Congratulations, you've just booked a medieval dental appointment. The boy climbs onto the chair, trembling as the barber pries open his mouth. The pliers clamp down, the crowd leans in, and you step back, shuddering. In this world, the line between healer and torturer blurred, and the price of relief was paid in blood, screams, and shattered enamel. The echoes of tooth-pulling fade behind you. But soon you hear another sound: low chanting, broken by screams that aren't caused by saws or pliers. You edge closer and find yourself in a dim chapel, the air heavy with incense. A young man thrashes on the floor, his wrists bound with rope. A priest stands over him, sprinkling holy water and shouting Latin verses. This isn't a medical procedure, at all, at least, not in your sense of the word. It's an exorcism, performed because the patient's mind has betrayed him. In the Middle Ages, mental illness was often seen not as a medical condition, but as a spiritual invasion. Depression could be mistaken for sloth or sin, anxiety for cowardice, epilepsy for demonic possession. If someone shouted nonsense in the streets or shook uncontrollably, neighbors whispered of devils. The treatment, not rest or therapy, but prayer, relics, or outright exorcism. Mainstream fact: monasteries sometimes took in the mentally ill, but rather than medical treatment, patients received confinement, prayer, and penance. Some were chained in cells, fed sparingly, and left to fast out their demons. Others were paraded through churches for public prayers. The logic was that healing came from God, not from the body's chemistry. You watch the priest press a crucifix against the man's forehead. The patient screams, whether from fear, pain, or sheer exhaustion, you can't tell. Onlookers cross themselves, some crying, some whispering. They believe this is holy warfare, a battle for the man's soul. In reality, it might be epilepsy or schizophrenia, conditions the era had no words for. Here's a quirky tidbit: some believed music could drive out madness. Fiddlers were hired to play lively tunes in asylums or at bedsides, hoping rhythm might unsettle the demon and lure it out. Imagine replacing modern therapy sessions with a medieval jam session. Doctor, I'm feeling anxious. No problem. Let's try 3 hours of bagpipes. The priest continues his ritual, sprinkling salt into the man's mouth, chanting louder. The patient writhes, eyes rolling back. The crowd gasps when he finally collapses, limp, silent. To them, this is proof the demon has fled. To you, it looks like exhaustion has won. Still, the onlookers cheer quietly, their faith in divine healing reaffirmed. Historians still argue whether exorcisms sometimes provided a form of placebo therapy. Did the intense ritual, the attention, and the belief in healing occasionally soothe sufferers, or did it worsen their conditions by layering fear and stigma on top of illness? The line between help and harm is blurry, written in whispers and screams. The chapel smells of incense, sweat, and candle smoke. It's oppressive, but strangely mesmerizing, as though belief itself hangs in the air. You glance at a young woman kneeling nearby, her wrists scarred. She clutches a rosary, whispering that she too feels haunted. The priest nods, promising to schedule another ritual. You realize this isn't isolated, it's systemic. Mental illness wasn't hidden in silence, it was put on display as evidence of spiritual struggle. For a modern aside, today, mental health treatment might involve therapy, medication, and support groups. In the medieval world, it was chains, prayers, and exorcisms, sometimes gentle, often brutal, always framed as a fight between heaven and hell. As you slip out of the chapel, the chanting fades, but the image lingers, a man trembling on the stone floor, his suffering misread as demonic fury. In this world, the mind was a battlefield, and medicine didn't speak its language. Only the priests did, and their cures were drenched in incense and fear. You leave the chapel behind, ears still echoing with chants, and find yourself in the courtyard of a university. Students in long robes gather around a teacher who's drawing circles and diagrams in the dirt. At first you think it's astronomy again, but no, these are diagrams of the humours. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Welcome to the endless medieval debates about balance. To physicians, every illness boiled down to these four fluids. Too much blood, you were feverish. Too much phlegm, you were sluggish and cold. Black bile made you melancholic, yellow bile made you angry. Every symptom was explained by imbalance, and every cure aimed at restoring harmony. It was elegant, simple, and hopelessly wrong. But for centuries, it was medicine's holy grail. Mainstream fact, the theory of humours came from ancient Greek. Medicine, especially Hippocrates and Galen, and dominated European thought for over a millennium. Medieval doctors quoted these authorities as gospel, adjusting treatments like diets, bloodletting, or purges depending on which humour they thought had gone rogue. The teacher gestures dramatically, insisting that melancholy comes from excess, black bile. A student raises his hand and counters, perhaps it's not bile at all, but spiritual sadness, they argue, gesturing at the sky, at the ground, at their own bellies. The debate grows heated, even though the patient waiting nearby just wants someone to stop his diarrhea. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some physicians swore that personality itself came from humours. If you were cheerful, you were sanguine blood. Quiet and thoughtful, phlegmatic. Angry, choleric, yellow bile. Gloomy, melancholic. People even joked about their humours in taverns, imagine saying, "Sorry, I'm cranky. My bile's acting up again." You watch as a patient is called forward. The doctor feels his pulse, examines his tongue, and declares an excess of heat and moisture. The cure, a diet of cold, dry foods, bread, lettuce, maybe cucumber. He also prescribes a gentle bleeding, just to be safe. The patient nods, resigned. It's not really a choice. This is the system everyone trusts. Historians still argue whether humour theory should be dismissed as nonsense or respected as an early attempt at systematic medicine. After all, it was consistent, logical in its own way, and gave doctors a framework to follow. The problem was that it didn't match reality, leading to treatments that often harmed more than helped. But without microscopes, without germ theory, it was the best model they had. The students scribble notes, sketching diagrams of hot, cold, wet, and dry. You realize that this isn't just medical theory, it shapes diet, lifestyle, even personality labels. Entire lives are explained by fluids no one can actually see. 4. A modern aside, think of fad diets today, people blaming carbs, sugar, or gluten for everything from fatigue to headaches. The medieval version was humours. Oh, you're sad, definitely black bile. Better eat more lentils. Different vocabulary, same desperate search for simple answers. As the debate winds down, the teacher raises his voice. Balance is life, imbalance is death. The students cheer, even as the patient slumps on the bench, pale and sweating. You can't help but feel sorry for him, his misery reduced to an abstract chart of fluids. You step back, the chants of blood, phlegm, bile, echoing like a strange anthem. In this world, medicine wasn't about germs or cells. It was about balance, for invisible forces swirling inside you, controlling everything from your health to your mood. And though it seems absurd now, back then it was the one truth everyone believed, debated, and bled for. You leave the university courtyard behind. But the sounds of debate are quickly replaced by a softer, more intimate kind of struggle. The cries of women, the hurried footsteps of midwives, and the smell of sweat and herbs. You've stumbled into a medieval birthing chamber place, where life itself hung by the thinnest of threads. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. With no anesthetics, no antiseptics, and very little understanding of anatomy, the risks were staggering. Infection, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor killed countless mothers. Newborns, too, faced terrifying odds. The survival of both was never guaranteed. In fact, it was a miracle when things went smoothly. Mainstream fact: maternal mortality in medieval Europe was estimated at around 1 in 10 births. For many women, giving birth was not just about welcoming new life but staring death in the face. Families often gathered nearby, torn between hope and dread, praying as loudly as the midwife shouted instructions. Inside the chamber, you see a woman gripping the wooden bed frame, her face slick with sweat. Two midwives hover beside her, one holding her shoulders, the other checking the baby's progress. Their tools: a bundle of cloths, a knife for cutting the cord, and a few herbs, sage, rue, or pennyroyal to ease pain or stimulate the womb. Quirky tidbit: some midwives advised placing holy relics on the mother's belly to ease the birth, or whispering charms meant to open the womb. One charm involved tying the key to a church's tabernacle around the mother's neck, as if unlocking divine grace would unlock her body too. Imagine going into labor today and someone saying, "Quick, grab the house keys, it'll help." The cries intensify. The midwife urges the mother to push, chanting both instructions and prayers. The room smells of blood and sweat, mixed with burning herbs meant to purify the air. There's no doctor here. Childbirth was the realm of women. Male physicians were rarely present, called only in extreme emergencies, and even then, their knowledge often did more harm than good. Historians still argue whether medieval midwives were more skilled than physicians in childbirth. Some evidence suggests they had practical knowledge passed down through generations, making them effective in routine births. But when complications arose, breech babies, hemorrhage, the lack of surgical options was fatal. C-sections were rarely attempted on living mothers. Most were performed only after the woman had died in an effort to save the child. Suddenly, a baby's wail cuts through the room. The midwife holds up a slippery, crying infant, the mother collapsing back in relief. The cord is cut, the newborn swaddled, and prayers of thanks fill the air. Yet even now, danger lingers. Infection could set in at any moment. For a modern aside, think of maternity wards today: sterile gloves, fetal monitors, epidurals. Whole teams ready to respond to emergencies. Now strip that away. What's left? Is this wooden room, candlelight, and the raw determination of women relying on experience, faith, and luck. As you step back from the bed, the newborn's cry fades into coos and murmurs of gratitude. But the image is sobering. In the medieval world, childbirth wasn't just about beginnings. It was about survival against terrifying odds, where every birth carried both the promise of life and the shadow of death. You leave the birthing chamber behind, but almost immediately your nose wrinkles at a smell so foul it makes the hospital stench seem almost polite. Ahead, you see a healer crouched beside a man with a festering wound, carefully scooping something from a wooden bucket. At first, you think it's mud. Then you realize, with horror, it's dung. Welcome to the world of animal excrement poultices. Yes, medicine by manure. In medieval medicine, the line between natural and disgusting didn't exist. If it came from the earth or from a creature, it was fair game for healing. And so, cow dung, pig dung, goose droppings all made their way into ointments and wound dressings. To us, it's revolting. To them, it was practical, warm, sticky, easy to smear, and full of the mysterious power of nature. Mainstream fact: recipes for dung-based remedies appear in multiple medieval medical texts. Cow dung was thought to draw out infection, donkey dung to stop bleeding and pig dung to soften. Swellings. Sometimes the dung was mixed with honey or herbs to create a paste, layered onto wounds like a crude, smelly bandage. You gag as the healer pats a lump of cow manure directly onto the man's leg. The patient winces, then relaxes as the warmth seeps in. The healer nods approvingly, explaining that the heat and earthly essence of the dung will rebalance the humors and pull out poison. Meanwhile, the smell curls into your throat like smoke, making you wish for a plague doctor's beak mask. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some remedies specifically required the freshest dung, ideally still warm from the animal. Others insisted on aged manure, ground into a powder and sprinkled like medicine. There are even accounts of pigeon droppings mixed with vinegar to treat baldness. Imagine telling your friends you're rubbing bird poop on your head for thicker hair. Medieval. Self-care at its worst. The healer stirs the bucket again, scooping a handful for another patient. Thighs buzz greedily, and the sour stench clings to your skin. Yet the crowd around him murmurs respect. This is an accepted cure, as valid as herbs or leeches. To reject it would seem foolish, even arrogant. After all, if animals lived close to nature, surely their waste carried some of that vitality. Historians still argue whether these treatments ever helped. Some dung might have had mild antiseptic properties, or maybe the honey mixed in provided the real benefit. But often dung poultices likely worsened infection, adding bacteria instead of healing. The tragedy is that many healers genuinely believed they were helping, even as the patient's fate worsened under their hands. For a modern aside, think of the ointments you see on pharmacy shelves, neatly packaged, clinically tested, smelling of menthol or lavender. Now imagine grabbing a bucket from a barn, smearing its contents on a wound, and calling it medicine. That's the leap from modern to medieval healing. The patient sighs. Whispering a prayer, the healer pats the manure, poultice like a baker smoothing dough, then wraps it with cloth. He assures the man that by morning, the corruption will be gone. Whether that's true or not, the patient believes him, and belief is half the battle here. As you back away, holding your sleeve over your nose, you realize the medieval world had no boundary between disgusting and medicinal. If it came from nature, it was trusted, even if that meant smearing your body with the one thing you'd spend all day trying to avoid. You hurry away from the dung healer, gagging into your sleeve. But before long the stench is replaced by the faint jingle of bells and the murmur of whispered prayers. You find yourself at a small wooden table where a woman lays out charms, rings and scraps of parchment scrawled with odd symbols. Patients approach her not with wounds bleeding, but with fear in their eyes. This is the world of magical medicine where amulets and incantations were prescribed as eagerly as herbs or surgery. In the medieval imagination, illness was as much spiritual as physical. If unseen forces or curses could make you sick, then charms and chants might drive them away. Medicine wasn't only knives and leeches, it was also words, symbols and objects charged with mystical power. And people clung to these rituals with the same desperation they clung to poultices and prayers. Mainstream fact, medical charms were recorded in texts like the *Leech Book of Bold Asterisk, an Old English collection of remedies, some instructions blended. Herbs with spoken incantations, for example, boiling plants while chanting prayers to saints. Others involved writing Latin words or biblical verses on parchment, then wearing them around the neck to protect against disease. The healer before you holds up a silver ring inscribed with crosses. She whispers that it will ward off fevers if worn on the left hand. Another patient brings her child, pale and trembling, and she ties a strip of parchment around the child's wrist. The parchment is covered in symbols, prayers, and what looks suspiciously like doodles of animals. She insists the illness will pass if the charm stays dry. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some charms instructed patients to eat the parchment itself, ink and all, so that the sacred words could travel inside the body. Others required writing verses on an apple, then consuming it. Imagine your doctor today handing you a prescription that says, "Chew on this Bible verse and wash it down with cider." The crowd around her nods solemnly. For them, this isn't superstition, it's medicine. After all, words held power. If prayers could heal the soul, why not the body? You notice one patient wearing a necklace strung with wolf teeth, another with a scrap of cloth from a saint's shrine. Protection to them is portable, wearable, chantable. Historians still argue whether these charms were taken literally as cures, or whether they served more as psychological comfort. Did people truly believe a parchment bracelet could cure plague? Or did it simply give them the courage to face an illness with hope? Either way, the charms filled a role where medicine often failed. Reassurance. The healer now begins a chant, half in Latin, half in the local tongue, over a man with a fever. She waves rosemary in the smoke of a candle, tracing circles in the air. The man closes his eyes, sweating, lips moving as if repeating the words himself. When she finishes, he presses a coin into her hand and walks away, still pale but comforted. For a modern aside, think of good luck bracelets, crystals, or inspirational tattoos today. They might not cure disease, but they give people a sense of strength, control, and hope. Medieval charms worked the same way, only cloaked in religious and magical authority. As you step back, the tinkling of charms and whispered prayers fades into the night. You realize that in this world, medicine wasn't limited to the body. It stretched into the realm of belief, where words could be swallowed, symbols worn, and protection whispered into existence. And whether or not it worked physically, the comfort it brought was a medicine all its own. You leave behind the charm seller's table, but the night isn't done with you yet. The smell of wax and the low hum of voices draw you toward a stone building, its windows shuttered, a faint glow leaking through the cracks. Inside, a group of students huddle around a wooden slab lit by dozens of candles. On the slab lies a human, body pale, stiff, and partially covered. You've stumbled into the forbidden world of medieval anatomy lessons. Officially, dissection was frowned upon, even condemned in many parts of Europe. Bodies were sacred, not to be cut or probed like objects. Yet curiosity is a powerful thing, and some physicians, hungry for knowledge, secretly carved open corpses to learn what lay beneath. Tonight, you're witnessing one of those rare and dangerous lessons. Mainstream fact, by the 13th century, universities like Bologna occasionally allowed public dissections of executed criminals. These events were rare, often once a year, and highly ritualized. A professor would read from Galen's ancient texts while an assistant cut into the body, trying to match theory with reality. Most of the time, the text was treated as more trustworthy than the corpse itself. If the body disagreed with Galen, the body was wrong. You watch as the master gestures dramatically, reciting in Latin about the fahumers and the organs that supposedly balanced them. The student with the knife hesitates, then slices into the belly. A sickly smell of decay and old blood floods the room, candles flickering in the draught. Students gag, but none dare turn away. Knowledge was worth the stench. Here's a quirky tidbit. When bodies weren't available, students sometimes practiced on animals, pigs, monkeys, even dogs, believing their anatomy was close enough to humans. This occasionally led to bizarre mistakes, like describing a human liver with features it never had. Historians still argue whether these comparative dissections advanced science, or simply confused generations of students. You edge closer and see the assistant lifting organs, slippery in the candlelight. The professor drones on. Here is the liver, the seat of blood. Here, the heart, the source of warmth. Whether he's correct or not, the students scribble furiously, eager to absorb every word. The smell thick and sweet, metallic, rotting. One student faints, collapsing into the straw. The others ignore him. For a modern aside, think of today's medical schools: bright lights, stainless steel, careful gloves, sterile labs. Now replace that with a smoky chamber, flickering candles, a corpse already half rotten, and a nervous student cutting with a dull blade. This was the classroom of medieval medicine. The body is stitched back together clumsily. Candles snuffed one by one. The students whisper excitedly as they leave. Their faces pale, but their eyes alive with curiosity. They've glimpsed forbidden knowledge, torn between reverence for the sacred and hunger for the truth. As you step out into the cool night air, you realize this world's medicine wasn't just bloodletting and charms. It was also daring curiosity in secret chambers. Beneath the superstition and stink, there were always those willing to cut deeper, to see for themselves what the body hid, and though their lessons reeked of rot, they were carving the first shaky steps toward the anatomy we know today. The whispers of the anatomy hall fade as you drift toward a brightly lit chamber in a castle. The atmosphere here is different, rich fabrics on the walls, polished silver bowls, and servants hovering at every corner. This isn't peasant medicine anymore. You've arrived at the royal court, where kings and queens submitted themselves to remedies as bizarre as they were expensive. Royal patients weren't treated with dung poultices or moss, at least not openly. Their cures had to reflect their status, and so, instead of simple herbs, physicians offered precious stones, rare spices, and concoctions that glittered as much as the crowns their patients wore. Mainstream fact, medieval texts described treatments for the wealthy that included drinking powdered pearls, ground coral, and even gold leaf dissolved in wine. These substances were thought to strengthen the heart, balance humors, and ward off poison. In reality, they provided little more than expensive stomach aches, but to the royal mind, the rarer the cure, the more potent it must be. A physician now presents a goblet of wine laced with crushed gemstones. The king lifts it to his lips with solemn dignity, ignoring the fact that he's essentially sipping sandpaper. The physician assures him this potion will fortify his essence and stabilize the balance of humors. The courtiers murmur approval, though you suspect they'd rather be drinking plain wine themselves. Here's a quirky tidbit. As all strange stones found in the stomachs of goats were prized at court as universal antidotes to poison, they were set into gold cups or worn as amulets. Historians still argue whether they had any actual detoxifying effect. Some experiments suggest they might absorb certain toxins, but the hype far outweighed the science. Either way, nobles were willing to pay fortunes for them. The queen, meanwhile, reclines on a velvet cushion, her physician applying an ointment made of saffron, rose water, and ground pearls to her temples for headaches. The smell is sweet, luxurious, a world away from vinegar and dung. Servants fan the air, ensuring even the healing process feels regal. But not all royal remedies were glamorous. Some monarchs submitted to the same brutal bloodletting as commoners, though done with gold-plated instruments. Others were fed bizarre diets like roasted wolf's heart or powdered unicorn horn, usually narwhal. Tusk again believed to bring vitality. The line between science and spectacle blurred, wrapped in silk and served with pomp. For a modern aside, imagine a celebrity today announcing they drink smoothies laced with diamond dust for health. It sounds absurd, yet it's not. So, different from royals sipping gemstone wine in medieval Europe. Well, didn't always buy better medicine, it just bought stranger, shinier versions of the same flawed ideas. You watch as the king swallows another mouthful of jewel-laced wine, wincing slightly at the grit between his teeth. The physician beams with pride as though he's just secured the kingdom's survival through alchemy. Servants applaud quietly, and the room fills with a sense of ritual, half medicine, half theater. As you step back, the contrast hits you. In the streets, peasants are smeared with dung and bled into bowls. In the castle, rulers sip powdered gems and clutch bezels, and yet, at the core, both worlds share the same desperation, the belief that any cure, no matter how strange or foul, is worth the attempt. The royal chamber fades behind you, jewels and gold giving way to the quiet grey of dawn. The streets are emptier now, the fire's burning low, and you realize you've walked through a world where medicine was as much faith, desperation, and ritual as it was knives and herbs. But something shifts as the horizon glows, because just at the edge of this grim medieval world, change is stirring. You're stepping into the slow dawn of the Renaissance, when medicine begins to loosen its grip on superstition. For centuries, healers clung to Galen's humors, to relics and charms, to dung poultices and leech jars. But as Europe crawled toward the 15th and 16th centuries, cracks began to show. Physicians and scholars still quoting the ancients started questioning them, too. Anatomy lessons grew bolder, dissections more public. and books spread ideas faster than ever thanks to the printing press. Mainstream fact. In 1543, Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica one of the first truly detailed studies of human anatomy. He directly challenged Galen's authority, showing that the body didn't match the old texts. It was a watershed moment. Knowledge now came from observation, not just repetition. The shift was slow, but it was revolutionary. You picture the candlelit chamber you saw earlier, the nervous students carving into corpses. Soon, their descendants will sketch with precision, publish with woodcuts, and finally break free of unquestioned tradition. Bloodletting won't vanish overnight, nor will leeches or charms, but step by step, medicine inches closer to science. Here's a quirky tidbit. Even as Renaissance scholars advanced anatomy and surgery, some still clung to bizarre practices. For example, powdered mummy remained a popular cure well into the 17th century, and astrology still influenced diagnoses. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance truly ended medieval medicine, or simply dressed it up with better books and prettier tools. The sun rises higher, washing the crooked streets in pale gold. You remember the sick rooms reeking of pus, the barber's blood-soaked apron, the jars of wriggling leeches, the dung poultices slapped onto wounds. You also remember the hope the mother clutching her baby in the birthing room, the pilgrim pressing cloth to a relic, the patient sighing after a tooth finally torn free. Medieval medicine was brutal, grotesque, and often wrong, but it was also deeply human, rooted in the universal desire to survive. For a modern aside, when you walk into a hospital today, surrounded by technology, trained professionals, and sterile order, it's easy to forget how new this world is. Only a few centuries separate you from an age when healing meant smoke, prayer, and sawdust. The streets around you grow brighter, and the night of medieval medicine fades. The Renaissance is coming, and with it, curiosity and observation will start to outshine superstition. But the shadows of leeches, charms, and bleeding bowls will linger for centuries, proof that medicine has always been a messy, stumbling march toward truth. And now, as the last echoes of saws, chants, and cries fade into silence, let's soften the pace. You've walked through narrow streets and smoky chambers, smelled the rot of wounds and the sharp sting of herbs, and listened to the desperate prayers of people clinging to life. It's been vivid, grotesque, and overwhelming, but here, as the sun rises on that world, you can let go of its weight. Breathe slowly. Imagine the streets emptying, the sick rooms quieting, the fires in the forges cooling to embers. The barber's tent is folded away, the jars of leeches tucked into shadow, and the relics resting behind locked church doors. For now, the world grows still. Even the foulest odors seem to lift and drift into the morning air, carried away by a breeze that promises something gentler. You picture the patients you passed along the way, their moans easing into whispers, then into silence. Some will not wake again, but others will. Against all odds, life goes on, and so does progress. The horrors you witnessed weren't cruelty, they were attempts at compassion, at healing, at surviving with the tools at hand. Imperfect, yes, but human in every sense. Now imagine yourself lying back, no longer among the crowds, but in your own quiet space. No leeches, no saws, no foul poultices, just the hum of a fan, the dim glow of a nightlight, the soft rhythm of your own breath. Let the chaos of medieval medicine fade like a dream you've already told and retold, until its edges blur and soften. You are here, safe, far from the cries and smells of that world. Rest easy. History's weight can be set down now. Close your eyes. Drift.